Welcome everyone. My name is Kristen Rossler and I am one of the physician liaisons at Texas Children's Hospital. Thank you for joining us today for addressing racism and discrimination related distress in youth. We are pleased to offer such a timely and important topic from our pediatric psychology team. We hope you will find this information valuable for the patients and families you serve. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Throughout the meeting, please make sure your microphone and video camera are off. If you have a question during any part of the presentation, please use the chat feature. Questions may be addressed by the speakers during the presentation or at the end. If we cannot answer each question, we will work with the speakers to provide an answer and follow up with you after the event. Please note this presentation will be recorded and the event will be accessible online soon. Now let's get started. Please welcome Dr. Karen Price, Chief of Psychology Services.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited today to introduce you to two of our incredibly talented psychologists here at Texas Children's Hospital, two women who I am honored to call colleagues. Doctors Ashley Butler and Gia Washington serve as the chair and co-chair of the Collaborative on Racial Equity and Inclusion for Black Youth, which was launched in the psychology service after the murder of George Floyd. The collaborative aims to promote resilience and racial equity by addressing the needs of our African American patients, colleagues, and community members and their allies. Just to let you know a little bit more about Dr. Butler, she is an associate professor of psychology here in the Department of Pediatrics at Baylor. She joined our faculty in 2011 after receiving her PhD from the University of Florida at Gainesville and completing her psychology internship at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She then completed a clinical fellowship and a Ford Foundation research fellowship here at Baylor. Dr. Butler is a pediatric health disparities researcher, investigating community and family-based behavioral interventions for African American and Latino parents of children with chronic health conditions such as type 1 diabetes. Dr. Butler is also a committed mentor for early career researchers and students from underrepresented backgrounds who are interested in pediatric health disparities. She's also highly committed to using her expertise to inform minority pediatric health policy. Dr. Gia Washington holds Master of Science and doctorate degrees in clinical psychology from St. Louis University and a Master of Arts degree in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Houston at Clear Lake. She also earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Spelman College. Clinically, Dr. Washington works with children and adolescents diagnosed with various chronic and acute medical conditions, including sickle cell disease, diabetes, HIV, obesity, cancer, and gynecological disorders. Dr. Washington often provides trainings on multicultural competence, adolescent development, and mental health issues and cultural practices of African Americans. She also serves as the director of the Texas Children's Hospital Parallel Program for Peer Support. I am really excited for you all to hear Drs. Butler and Washington talk today about addressing racism and discrimination related distress in youth, and I will hand it over to them.
So thank you everyone for attending this talk today. I am very appreciative of this invitation to talk about such a crucial topic. As we're becoming aware of the ways broadly in which the COVID-19 pandemic is really taking a toll on children's mental health, we really also see that Black children in particular are affected by twin pandemics, both COVID-19 as well as what some folks are really coining as the racism pandemic. So Black children are really highly exposed to these seemingly limitless videos of police brutalizing people who look like themselves or who look like their loved ones. And they're also really exposed to images that really represent fear, hate, and can really be representative of trauma in the Black community, such as this image here on the right in the middle. That's a picture of a noose outside of the Capitol building during the Capitol riot. We know that studies published even before the murder of George Floyd showed that Black youth in particular are exposed to discrimination that's really directed towards them online, or witnessing discrimination targeted towards other Black individuals online. We know that before the murder of George Floyd, that greater than 65% of Black youth reported this. And what's really striking to note is that it's not just the discrimination that is targeted towards the individual, but really also witnessing discrimination against another Black person. It's related to increased anxiety, it's related to depression, as well as academic difficulties. And we know that interviews, such as interviews that have been published online through STAT, shows that older Black teens and emerging adults really report that since the murder of George Floyd, that it's really taken a toll on their mental health. Some excerpts from that interview really reveal heightened feelings of stress, anxiety, and sadness. So, for example, one young man or young teen male indicated, "I come from a family that always sees God will take care of us. But right now I feel a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and really sadness for my community. We've had pain bottled up for so long, and it's now reached the surface." Another young teen indicated, "When it comes to the violence, I can tell you I'm so disappointed. But the sad part is, this is our history. It's typical for Black men and women to get killed by the police. There's only so much pain you can feel about it. I want justice, but I have to separate this from my own mental health and making sure I'm not taking too much of it all in. It's hard to see the portrayals of what's going on." And then finally, another teen said, "Now since the video, my heart just aches. Every time we see violence like this, you have to hope that it will be the last time, but then it's not." And so when you all think about this, I'd like to ask your participation using the chat feature. If you could just indicate, how often do you think Black youth experience discrimination? So thinking about experiencing being treated unfairly based on their race. Would you say 5 times per year, once per month, 5 times per month, once daily, or 5 times each day? What we know is, I was really surprised by the recent statistic that showed that collected data from last year and showed that Black teens actually face discrimination up to 5 times each day. Discrimination is happening a lot. We know another study that assessed experiences with discrimination even before the pandemic or before the murder of George Floyd showed that in a given year, that about 95% of African American youth indicate experiencing at least one experience of discrimination. So nearly all youth are experiencing that each and every year. Those things that seem to be the most frequent acts of discrimination against Black youth include them being others seeming like they're afraid of them, being treated as if they are stupid, or being accused of something, or really treated unfairly. And we know that experiencing discrimination, really is not something that's trivial. It really has a significant impact on both depression as well as stress. And what's interesting about this study that showed this relationship between discrimination, depression, and stress is that, in particular, for African American teens, who perceive that other groups, other racial and ethnic groups, do not hold, highly negative perceptions of African Americans. Those are the teens who tend to really experience significant symptoms of depression or stress when they do face discrimination. And so Dr. Washington will talk about this in a moment, but it really provides some support for, what we commonly know, that African American parents tend to prepare their youth for discrimination. And these findings show that practice may indeed protect them from experiencing difficulties with their mental health. And so before I turn it over to Dr. Washington, I'd just like to note that, I really believe that here in the Houston community and the larger Texas community, that we really have an opportunity really to be at the forefront of optimizing clinical practice to ameliorate these inequities with regard to discrimination and racism against Black youth, as Texas really is the state with the largest number of Black people, as well as Black children in particular. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Washington.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Butler. I'm going to begin to share my screen. And you all can see that, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, wonderful. So in my portion, I'm going to focus on specifically racial trauma and your role as a healthcare provider, upstander, and ally. Now, the term upstander may be familiar to many of you, or it might be somewhat of a new term. It was certainly more of a new term for me within the past year, as we're talking about allyship and participation of others in Black lives, the support and improvement in Black lives. So I'm going to focus specifically around the effects of racial trauma for Black youth and Black families, and what you can ask and how you can help as a healthcare provider, an upstander, and an ally. Okay, so let's talk for a second about racial trauma. Essentially, this is a definition of racial trauma, which is the cumulative effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. It may present as anxiety, depression, or physical health issues, and suicidal ideation. But I have here a few different images. Some may be familiar to you, and some others might be new. And I'll walk through each of them and kind of give you some background and talk about some ways that you can access further information on the internet if you're interested. I'm going to start on my far right. These are all, again, examples of how racial trauma has impacted the lives of these individuals that are profiled, but also broader, having a more pervasive and broader reach in African American culture. So on the far right, you'll see a picture of a young Black girl who is 10 years old. Her name is Ziana Elephant. She lives in Charlotte. And in September of 2016, she participated in a Charlotte City Council meeting where individuals were asked to come forward and speak, particularly regarding the murder of a Black man in their community by a police officer. If you're interested in watching this video, it's on Vimeo, and it's a short snippet. But it really very clearly exemplifies her racial trauma, her reaction to her increased knowledge now as a 9 or 10-year-old, understanding some other things about the world that she maybe didn't know a few years ago, but really it having more of an impact on her as a young Black girl, and her concern for how Black people are treated in general and what it means for her as a Black child. So I would encourage you to view that. If you haven't seen that before, it's quite powerful and impactful. And then moving into the left side, the picture next to her is of a young Black girl with the books around her. Now, this is referencing a story that went viral in September of 2020. A young Black girl by the name of Iris Hawk Lokoyo, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, who's 10 years old as well, was in a virtual classroom here in Houston, and the class was learning about American history. She felt like the information was being glossed over regarding slavery made a comment and felt incredibly dismissed by the teacher at the time. She wrote an essay about it, and her mom posted it on the internet, and it went viral. But essentially, what I found most interesting about that story that's on lily.com about her experience was her feeling in the moment of speaking up, attempting to inquire about things that she knows about the history of America, particularly related to the participation of Black people and enslaved men and economic resources in this country, and her feelings of being shut down or unsupported when she attempted to further that conversation. It's noteworthy that in the article, it points out that she's the only Black child in her classroom, and her teacher is non-Black as well. So she felt really unsupported and shut down, and was able to write about her experience of that trauma in that moment, and also got support from her mom and other people once it went viral. It's quite touching as well. In preparation for this talk, I've been doing a lot of reflection on things, stories, images, things that are familiar to me about Black children and racial trauma. And probably about a week and a half ago, I found myself waking up in the morning. The first thought on my mind was Tamir Rice's sister. So Tamir Rice is that third, the center picture, kind of off the center, this little boy with the hooded, playing with what was perceived to be an actual gun, but it was a toy gun in a city park. And many of you probably know the story. A police officer arrived and shot him without any warning, conversation, or anything. You've probably seen the video, those of you who are familiar with that. But what I recall about that, in addition to the trauma and the sadness and the anger and the fear, was the fact that his sister was playing with him that day in the park. She was in the park with them, with other kids. She didn't see him, but other kids told her that that happened. And when she arrived to where he was, she, in her grief and her trauma, as you can anticipate, reacted with a very intense emotion, and she was tackled and handcuffed by the police and put in the back of her police cruiser without any knowledge of really what happened to her brother. And you can imagine, Tamir was 12 at the time, and she was 14. She was probably told by their mother to watch him, go with him to the park, keep an eye on him. And I can imagine the impact of that, and how that could likely impact her ability to see herself as someone who's safe in the world because of what happened to him, but also her responsibility as a sibling. So you can see how in these situations, we're kind of building the case and understanding a bit more about racial trauma. And I'm sure a lot of you may know this about trauma. When you experience trauma, it sort of shortens your emotional response. At least for a significant period of time, you're very focused on that trauma, and you might present or experience emotions in perhaps a truncated way that could be very focused on that. So things like anxiety, depression, anger, having a negative attitude, being really irritable, not being open, not being willing to talk to someone. And I don't know exactly what happened for Tamir Rice's sister, but she was definitely on my mind as I was preparing for this talk. The image to the left of Tamir Rice's picture is one that many of you may also know as well. And this is a picture of Emmett Till, who was murdered in Mississippi in 1955. What is especially important, I think, about what happened to Emmett Till is that, he was 14, visiting family members in the summer of 1955, and visiting Southern culture, being in a Southern state and not really understanding some of the social mores, being accused of making an inappropriate comment or whistling. There's a lot of historical debate about what he was accused of doing. And then later on that evening, he was violently taken from his family's home by 3 white men and murdered that evening. What I find most relevant to me in this period of time in 2021 is that I recognize that his murder was so impactful for the generation that raised me, because they kind of grew up with him. They were children at the time that he was a child and he was 14. And because of their experience of the knowledge of what happened to him and the knowledge of how his body was found and funeralized and what he looked like at the time after that violence and trauma, that has remained with them as Black youth who became Black adults and parents and even grandparents, and that has impacted their parenting and their caretaking of younger Black individuals. So that intergenerational aspects of trauma are very relevant, and a lot of them stemming from the situation of what happened with Emmett Till, and also what happened to numerous other young men and young women, young Black men and young Black women in the United States. And what I'll also say is that what's noteworthy is that Emmett Till's murder also set forth the Children's Crusade, which is an aspect of the civil rights movement, where there were times where there were protests and there were marches and rallies, and Black adults at the time in the 50s and 60s were working and weren't able to participate in the things that were happening during the day because they had to support their families economically. But children and young adults were able to go and attend. So they able the Children's Crusade. And it was important to them at that time because Emmett Till was one of theirs. He was their age, someone that they could identify with, the same way that Tamir Rice was someone that many children identified with in 2012. And Iris and also Ziana, as mentioned in these pictures. The last one I wanted to comment on the left, the far left picture, is actually a snapshot of the title page of a study that was published by Georgetown Law in early 2020. And this is about the title is Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girl Childhood. And this is an interesting study in the sense that over 300 adults of various race and ethnicities in the United States were surveyed around their beliefs around kind of the differences between Black girls and white girls. And the findings reveal that typically Black girls are adultified. They're considered to be older, they're considered to be more experienced with life experience or even sexual experience than they are, that they're just perceived in that way. And a lot of times because of that, they're treated more severely in terms of punishment in the educational system and also the juvenile justice system. And they are in some ways set up to be much older than they are, and their childhood in some ways is erased, where compared to young white girls or other girls who are non-Black, those kids don't have that perception, or nor do they have that experience. What I also find noteworthy about that is that if there is something traumatic that happens to Black girls, typically they are not given the benefit of the doubt. Typically, they're not supported. Typically, they're not necessarily referred for psychotherapy. They're really thought of as a kid who needs to get over it, or perhaps their pain or trauma is ignored. So all of that to say, there is quite a bit of racial trauma that can follow families for generations, impact multitudes of families in the United States, and things that we need to be aware of as healthcare professionals. Okay, so I wanted to show you this example as well of intergenerational trauma and some things that Black adults, Black caregivers, Black parents attempt to do to support and prepare their Black children. This may be a familiar image or a video for some of you. This is actually a commercial that was published, I think, in 2017 by Procter & Gamble. And I'll just let it play, and then certainly if you have any questions or comments about it, you can enter that into the chat.
Gia, I don't think we're not able to hear the sound on this.
Okay.
Are you able to hear it?
Yep, I can hear it on my end. You all can't hear it?
Right.
Oh, okay. I'm very sorry. Well, then I'll just stop it. But you can certainly find it easily on YouTube. This particular version is the extended talk. It's called The Talk, Controversial Ad or Hard Truth, and it's about 2 minutes. Okay, so you can find that on your own. I'm very sorry about that. I could hear it on my end. Okay, so this is certainly something we can do together. We can talk about a particular case example about how racial trauma might present in a healthcare setting. So for those of you who might not be able to read this, I'll read it out loud. A biracial adolescent patient presented with abdominal pain and back pain to a medical setting. The results were inconclusive and the patient was sent home. Patient presented again the following day with worsening back pain. A psychiatry consult was called because results were inconclusive, and of course the patient presented again, and it found the following. The patient has been struggling with bullying. At the patient's predominantly white school, the patient reported feeling isolated and left out. The patient is very focused on making friends and often wishes that they were not half Black so they could fit in. The bullying intensified in middle school, which resulted in the patient self-harming and making attempts to kill themselves. The bullying got so bad, the patient's parents withdrew the patient from in-person school and is now attending school online. And this is, I think, a summary of what perhaps a lot of biracial teens or Black teens or children might experience in predominantly white educational settings, where some things have happened and they feel uncomfortable, perhaps overtly victimized. Maybe things have actually happened where people have said things to them about their race or ethnicity, called them names, thrown items at them, or they've excluded them from activities because of race or ethnicity, because of perhaps stereotypic thinking that they might have overheard or perhaps believe that those similar age peers believe. And then that child experiences that victimization and tries to do something to change their experience. Oftentimes turns that emotion inward and tries to either change something about themselves or change something about the environment in order to make that connection. And if that doesn't necessarily happen, then they go further inward and start to think about hurting themselves, experiencing anxiety and depression. A whole host of things could happen. And I think that this is really significant in the sense because what we could possibly see as adults, and especially those people who are caregivers, would be reports of a lot of pain, stomach, headache, school refusal. I just don't feel like doing it. When there's a much deeper internal process, I'm not liked at school. I don't have any friends. People don't talk to me. Something about me people don't like. I wish I looked different. I wish I could be smarter, better, faster, fairer, blue-eyed, whatever it is that child might be experiencing. And fortunately, in this situation, there was time, there were resources for that psychiatry consult to be called, and then this was revealed in that. And because of that, there could be some resources put in place for that child. So I just wanted to share that as an example of how far some of those feelings can go. There's certainly been more research recently about suicide attempts and completions, particularly for Black youth, whereas maybe that wasn't the case years before. And we don't always know, right, after the suicide, especially if it's been completed, what might have led up to that. But a lot of times, peer bullying, teasing, victimization is a component, and especially if it has a racial traumatic element to it, it's definitely something that we want to be aware of and work towards a solution. So let's move on to what you could potentially do as an upstander and an ally. So how would you assess for racial trauma in a pediatric visit? And these are a few suggestions. Something perhaps as simple as adding a prompt on an intake or history form. I think the referral form for our section lists a lot of things that might be bringing people in or seeking psychological services, concern for the child's behavior, anxiety, depression, not sleeping, not eating, adding a line dealing with racial discrimination, and maybe some space where a parent or a caregiver could write some details if they have that knowledge. And then of course, subsequently we do an extensive intake and history gathering. But just having that prompt on the history form, I think could be really powerful. And then, as I mentioned, physical symptoms seem to be what people see on the surface most. So seeking that patient and family's opinion on where those physical symptoms are coming from without perhaps communicating judgment or negation of a child's pain, but just simply inquiring about if those things could be stress related or stress induced. And then asking this specific question might also be incredibly helpful. And it might be helpful for you to kind of memorize it or write it down or put it into memory so that you can recall it. But that question is, have you, your child, or your family had an experience with racism that might be contributing to today's concern? I think that's an excellent way to ask without, again, judgment or expectation, but just inviting the conversation so that then we can get some resources in the hands of that family. And again, if you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat. We'll certainly have some time at the end for questions as well. So how else could you do this, especially if by chance you're a healthcare provider and you have an opportunity to interview that child by yourself? These are a few questions that you can ask in particular. Do you feel safe at school? A lot of times kids may feel physically safe, but not emotionally safe. Might be afraid to go into certain sections of the school when we're in school, when everyone's attending in face-to-face instruction. Places like the restrooms or the cafeteria or the library, where there's some like unstructured time where that peer victimization and bullying can really increase because there's not a lot of adults around. Sometimes kids won't feel very safe there at all because they know that that's an opportunity for that to increase. I know passing periods for the adolescents that I work with can also be a period of time where victimization can happen and a lot of teens can feel unsafe or lonely or excluded as well. Do you feel supported when race-related topics are discussed at school or with your friends? Certainly, I gave that example earlier about that particular story that went viral for that fifth grader who did not feel supported when race-related topics were discussed in virtual school. But also this can happen for any age kid, but I hear a lot of it happening for adolescents where their friends, good friends of theirs who might be non-Black, hold specific stereotypic beliefs around Black people or Black culture, and might make comments to them about their family or that child's knowledge of criminal activity or ability to be someone who has high athleticism, and perhaps that particular child doesn't. And so there's a lot of questions around why can't they run fast? Why can't they play basketball? Things that can be, again, associated with particular stereotypic beliefs around Black people, but it's really hard for that child to navigate at school. Do you feel included at school and in extracurricular activities? Again, I think this is something that takes this conversation a step further, but inquires in particular about how that Black child feels at school. Do people want to sit with you? Are you invited? Do you feel like you're part of the community? Or, which can also be detrimental, are you ignored? People just don't engage with you, or they avoid you. Just like Dr. Butler was saying earlier, that idea that people will avoid and that is a discriminatory action as well. So just starting the conversation with that question can be helpful. Have you ever felt excluded from group activities because you are Black? There's also a way that you can ask. So the health provider as an upstander and an ally. I think we all understand that allyism is working in partnership or in support of a particular individual, advocating for their rights. What I think is an important component of allyship is recognizing that typically you don't get to label yourself as an ally. You're usually identified as an ally because of that person who you've been in support of sees you as an ally. So that's part of that definition, the requirements, so to speak, of that identification, is that other individual sees you as an ally. So in this situation, a Black child or Black family sees you as an ally because of what you've said, because of what you've done, because of the relationship that you hold with them. And of course, an upstander is different from a bystander. A bystander would be someone who wouldn't be engaged, would maybe witness racism or discriminatory actions and not say anything, and just maybe take it in, or perhaps not know what to say and therefore not saying anything. That's more of a bystander. But an upstander in that moment can be someone who doesn't know what to say, but at least wants to get engaged in it. Look, I don't know what to say about this, but something about this wasn't right. And I just want to acknowledge that. I want to, step in between. You can kind of imagine at a school, a peer upstander stepping in between that victimized peer and that bully, kind of getting in between and stopping that, saying, no, that joke that you said really isn't funny. I don't want to hang out with you because if that's what you're thinking, those kinds of things where there's that action in place, that's what defines an upstander. So as a health provider, some of the things that we can do is being aware of our own privilege and bias. That helps us understand where our blind spots might be and helps us work towards being able to communicate support and allyship further. Being open to the conversation, being open to asking those questions, as I mentioned, and being open and being willing to listen to the answers can be incredibly impactful. Modeling the discussion every time, let's say for instance, every time that a Black family presented to a healthcare setting, if there was some conversation around racism and discrimination about their experiences or their perhaps secondary trauma, watching things on the news and in social media, it helps to encourage conversation. And you as a healthcare provider are modeling how to do that, not only with the patient family that you're working with, but with your colleagues and in the medical setting or the environment, school environment that you're in. Every time you do that, it makes it a little easier. Even if it continues to be somewhat uncomfortable, at least we're working towards it. Offering support, of course, advocating for Black children in all settings. If there's a Little League team that you consult with, or your school has some extracurricular clubs or activities, or the medical practice that you're in, if you're not seeing a lot of Black families, inquiring as to why, making sure that there are images that would resonate with Black children and Black families in your setting so that they feel comfortable and would not only access the services that you're providing, but follow through with the recommendations. All of those things carry weight and have some impact. And then providing resources such as therapy or legal counsel as needed, as you would for other social determinants of health, other issues that your patient population might have. You would do those things for them, doing that as well for Black children who might be experiencing some racial distress or racial discrimination. The main point is to say something, to do something and to say something. And I included an exclamation mark there just to represent the intensity and the importance of it. And the real issue is that your action will result in the improvement of Black lives. So it's not enough just to inquire, to gather information for your own edification or your own learning, but that action needs to be in place so that you can really participate as an upstander and an ally to improve the lives of the Black children that you're working with. Okay, so maybe for a few seconds in the chat, could you just type in, what specific actions have you taken to demonstrate that you are an upstander and an ally? And again, I know that some of these terms might be a little new, but I'm sure that there are things that you all have already been doing to make sure that the Black children in your professional care are included, feel supported, and there's no right or wrong answer. I think it's just important that we take an opportunity to learn from each other and see what's been happening so that we can further the discussion. I'll just pause for a second for people to type in the chat. And I can't see the chat on my end, so could someone let me know?
I do have it up, so I'm looking. So someone did say that they ask if students feel safe.
It's wonderful. Any other responses? And, I don't want to stack the deck, so to speak, in the sense of the slides that I showed a second ago being the only way that you could be an upstander or an ally. I'm sure that that's not the only way. I'm 100% certain it's not the only way to do that. I'm thinking even, opportunities that you might have, excuse me, as a parent or a caregiver, if your child is not Black, but they have Black friends, are you asking them, do you feel like your friend feels included at schools, or anything that we could talk about to make sure that, if your friend gets teased or bullied because of their race, how would you feel about stepping in for them? Let's maybe play that out. Like, what would you want to say? How can we help that? Just those kind of conversations as well. You can be a secondary upstander and ally, and maybe not always on the front lines, but certainly being open to that can make a big difference.
I see a lot of in the chat comments about really listening and showing empathy, even making, complimentary statements, for example, towards girls, letting them know that they're beautiful and unique. Some even standing up if they are a witness to a racist remark or comment. So really, taking a stance and letting the person know that that's not okay, or even asking them to leave and not be, at their home, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then there was a comment earlier that I think, relates to this in a way that the person noted an experience where a Black child was making negative kind of, I guess, self-statements or negative statements, maybe stereotypical statements related to Black people. And sort of, I think that's something that we haven't touched on, but that, racism can also be internalized, and, Black children could hold those, negative thoughts about themselves that are, really played out largely in the larger environment. That absolutely happens. And, I think there's an opportunity, even there to be an upstander and an ally in those situations, and a lot of ways to, promote positive identity by, making sure that, there are a lot of negative images and stereotypes out there, but being able to balance that with making sure children are aware of the positive and positive attributes of Black individuals and contributions to our society. A lot of times there are suggestions about that through books, and there are a lot of wonderful books out there. And I think as healthcare providers too, the book programs that exist within pediatric offices, making sure that there are books representative of that within the office can be another, a way to be an ally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love all of those ideas. I just wanted to comment on something quickly. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. That I think it's incredibly impactful in two ways, especially if you see a young Black child or teen, as Dr. Butler mentioned, making comments that are negative against their own self-interest, or against their own kind of cultural interests, so to speak, and inquiring about kind of where that's coming from. Sometimes I think children and preteens and adolescents will do that so that they can feel included, if that's sort of the message or things that they're picking up in the school environment, whether or not they really believe that or not. But they might repeat that. They might, in many ways, as I said, it's kind of vote against their own interests. And until that behavior is called upon, they might not even realize the impact, the sort of habituated thinking, and the impact that could have on their spirit as they continue to develop. Thinking, a certain way about themselves or their body or their hair texture or their complexion for many years can impact their self-esteem and their confidence and opportunities, goals, relationships. All those things are connected. So when you do see that happening, it could be incredibly important to intervene. And then along those same lines, especially for young Black women, body image is closely tied, as it is for all young women, I think, to self-esteem and confidence. And so, like being in an environment where your unique hair texture or presentation, style of dress isn't recognized, that you don't necessarily fit the ideal, but you have people around you who encourage your creativity and your uniqueness and your expression, can be incredibly impactful and make a huge difference as that young woman begins to develop. Again, seeing themselves as worthy and valuable and important and attractive can impact their ability to set goals and achieve them. And those are things that we want for all children. So I think it's important, again, to just recognize that. So thank you all for sharing that. This is my second to last slide. Dr. Butler and I wanted to let you know of a new specialty service that we're setting up in the psychology section, where we can take internal referrals under the patient care aspect of the collaborative that we co-lead. And this is a specialty clinical service designed to treat racial discrimination and racial trauma related to distress in Black youth. So if you'd like to make a referral to this particular service, perhaps you've had a medical appointment with a Black child or family and you recognize that there's some racial discrimination or racial distress, you can make an EPIC referral to the psychology service. You can certainly put my name on it. I won't say Dr. Butler's, but you can certainly put my name on it. And please include the terms racial distress or racial discrimination so that when it comes into our referral center, they'll know where to put it and where to put it for me in particular. All right. Okay, so then I'll open the floor for comments or questions. And I think I'm gonna stop screen share.
Yes, we do have a few minutes for questions or comments, so feel free to continue using the chat. You guys are doing a great job being so interactive, and we appreciate that so much. So yeah, if you have questions, just submit them there. And even if you think of something afterwards, just reach out to me or your liaison, and we will help get those answered for you.
I do see a question here about a list of, do we have a list of providers in the state of Texas? I think this person joining us is from in the area of Central Texas. And so one of the things that we are working on, as we are working on this specialized service is also having a website that will be housed on our regular psychology service webpage that describes more about the specialized service. And so, that's one of the things we could include for folks who are not, able to receive services here where we are in Houston or in the medical center. We currently don't have that, but that's something that we could absolutely work on building for this.
Yes, I can see this question, Dr. Butler. Would you offer video visits? Yes, we are conducting visits through telehealth, so that would be certainly possible.
And there's a question here about, is there a way that others can participate in this project and in this work that we're doing? We do have a email address if you'd like to contact us about that. It's racial equity and inclusion at texaschildren's.org. So feel free to reach out to us about that. I'll actually write that in the chat.
Well, thank you all again for joining us today and for being so interactive. Before we go, we wanted to let you know that we will be launching the new psychology service referral process. So stay tuned for that. I know there are a lot of school nurses on the call and a lot of private practice pediatricians who may not have access to those EPIC referrals. So once we get that process solidified, I can communicate that to the group. So stay tuned for that. If you're unsure who your physician liaison is, they're listed here along with the areas of town they serve. So you can always reach out to us to get your questions answered, or if you have questions about referral processes. To check the status of a referral or to speak with an on-call specialist 24/7, we do offer Provider Connect as well, and that phone number is listed here. And we do offer Epic CareLink for providers that are not currently on our network, and this just allows you to view your patient's notes, imaging, lab results, referral status, and a lot more. So a couple of our upcoming events we wanted to highlight. Our next event will be on Thursday, March 11th, and we'll focus specifically on hemangiomas, eczema, and acne. And then in April, we will be hosting an event on colorectal and pelvic health, and we will have more details on both to come. So we hope you will be able to join us for those, and we really appreciate your time today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.